Hi, I know I'm just a cat, but I believe in kindness. If you click subscribe under this video, you'll make my day.
They say family brings out your best and your worst. But whoever said that clearly never sat across from a cousin like Mark with a smug smile and a full glass of red, acting like every bite of ham was a reminder of how far he thought I hadn't come. It was Thanksgiving at Aunt Diane's again, which meant mismatched chairs, one too many casseroles, and a living room full of people pretending they were closer than they actually were. I flew in from Chicago the night before, left my team mid-sprint, and even took a call in the guest room at 2 a.m. because time zones don't care about turkey and stuffing. Still, I came. Because that's what good daughters do, what successful women with Midwestern guilt stitched into their bones always do. They show up. Mark, on the other hand, hadn't flown in from anywhere because, well, he hadn't left. He'd been living with Aunt Diane since his divorce last spring, parking his leased Mercedes crooked in her driveway like it was still 2010, and he was still running portfolios on Wall Street instead of picking up freelance gigs and telling anyone who'd listen that he was between ventures. I'd been at the table less than 10 minutes when he looked at me with that half grin and said it like a joke, like a knife dipped in butter. "So, you're still playing CEO?" I wish I could say I was surprised. But with Mark, there's always that undertone. Like your accomplishments are cute as long as they don't make his look smaller. Like success only counts if it comes in a suit and tie, not in a hoodie behind a laptop at 3 a.m. trying to keep servers from crashing. I didn't say anything, not yet. I just smiled, took a sip of Pinot, and made a mental note to remember that line. Because I knew even then, the comeback wasn't for today. It was for later. And oh, it was going to land hard. The table fell quiet for a moment. That kind of quiet you only notice when the clinking of forks suddenly feels too loud. Aunt Diane forced a laugh, the kind women make when they've spent their whole lives smoothing over messes made by the men they love. My dad cleared his throat, probably already regretting asking me to come. And then, from the end of the table, the only voice that mattered piped up, clear and steady, like she was ordering tea in the middle of a war. Isn't that what makes her his boss now? Grandma Ruth doesn't say much these days. At 82, she spends more time watching than talking. And when she does speak, everyone listens. Even Mark, even me. She didn't even look up when she said it, just kept buttering her roll like she was discussing the weather. And maybe that's what made it so perfect. Because in that one sentence, she cracked something open that nobody at that table had the courage to name. The truth. Mark's jaw tensed. Not clenched, tensed. It's a difference you only notice when you've been on the receiving end of that kind of male pride. The kind that can't stand being challenged, especially not by an old woman with perfect timing and a better memory than anyone gave her credit for. He didn't answer her. No one did. For a second, the whole table was suspended in that weird, humming tension that always comes right before someone makes a scene or leaves early pretending they had somewhere to be. You ever notice how fast a wine bottle empties when nobody wants to deal with real conversation? But that night, nobody reached to refill Mark's glass. It just sat there, half full, like a metaphor in the making. My mom asked who made the green bean casserole. Someone lied and said it was delicious. But all I could think about was that moment, that line. Grandma's words had sliced through the room like a scalpel, not dramatic, not loud, but precise and lethal. Here's the thing, success doesn't show up in neon lights. It doesn't walk into the room wearing medals or asking for applause. It slips in quietly, like smoke under a door, until suddenly everyone's choking on it. I'd been running my company for 3 years. Built it from scratch. Started in my kitchen between ramen dinners and weekend gigs. Scaled up with nothing but stubbornness and caffeine, and now employed 23 people, including 2 who used to be my bosses in past lives. We just closed Series B. I hadn't even told my family yet, because I knew, deep down, that the news would come second to someone like Mark's ego. But Grandma saw it. She always had. She remembered the years I spent staying home while everyone else went to parties. She remembered the time I canceled Christmas because my back-end system collapsed, and I had to rebuild it alone. She remembered the little girl who built Lego cities while the boys smashed them, who read business books instead of fairy tales. Grandma remembered, even if Mark never noticed. And that's when it hit me. I didn't have to answer him. I didn't need to defend anything. The table knew, even if they didn't say it out loud. They'd seen the balance shift. This year, Mark wasn't the one everyone asked for investment advice. He wasn't the one who brought a fancy date or arrived in a new car. He was just there, quiet, bitter, and clinging to whatever crumbs of superiority he still had left. I let it sit. Let the silence do the talking, because sometimes the best revenge isn't a speech or a showdown. Sometimes it's just letting someone drown in the emptiness of their own assumptions while you keep eating your damn ham. And if you're reading this thinking, should she have said something? Should she have defended herself? I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a room where you finally realized you'd outgrown every insult thrown your way? That you didn't need to prove anything because the proof was sitting in your bank account, in your inbox, in the way people looked at you differently when they thought no one was watching? That was me. And that was just the beginning. I've always believed that silence is a weapon far sharper than anything that can be said out loud. And while Mark might have taken my lack of response as weakness or hesitation, what he didn't understand, what he never could, was that some people are just building their ammunition while everyone else is firing blanks. That's the problem with men like him, the ones who peak early and confuse temporary success with divine entitlement. They spend the next 20 years waiting for everyone else to fail so they can feel relevant again. And in those awkward knife-edge moments between the turkey being carved and the pumpkin pie being sliced, I could see that slow realization crawl across his face. He was no longer the smartest guy in the room. And worse, he was the only one who hadn't figured it out yet. I kept eating. That's all I did. I asked Aunt Diane for the cranberry sauce and complimented the stuffing like nothing had happened, while Mark sat 2 seats down, gripping his fork with a little too much tension. The corners of his mouth pulled into a forced smile that wouldn't convince a drunk toddler. He kept looking at me like he was waiting for round 2, like I was going to rise to the bait and say something clever so he could fire back with a smirk and reclaim his throne as the family's reigning condescender-in-chief. But I didn't. I just waited, because I knew something he didn't. 3 days before Thanksgiving, I got a call from my assistant, Jenna, while I was still in the office working out final terms for a new round of funding. We'd been courting a sharp, seasoned financial strategist who came highly recommended from one of our top investors. Her resume was impressive. Former hedge fund VP, deep knowledge in fintech scaling, and a proven track record of cleaning up messy balance sheets and broken male egos. Her name was Samantha, Mark's ex-wife. At first, I hesitated. It wasn't that I had anything against her. Honestly, I barely knew her, but something about it felt poetic. Hiring your cousin's ex might have been questionable in a boardroom setting, but in a world where Mark had publicly scoffed at my business since the day I launched it, even going so far as to post passive-aggressive LinkedIn comments under my company announcements, I figured if fate was handing me this kind of symmetry, it would be rude not to take it. And Samantha, she wasn't just good, she was exactly what we needed. The best part? She applied without knowing I was the CEO. She just saw a growing startup with vision and reached out through the proper channels, impressed by our expansion and intrigued by the potential. And when she found out, after the second interview, that it was me behind the curtain, she laughed. Not a bitter laugh, but the kind that comes from realizing that sometimes the universe really does have a sense of humor. So while Mark was busy pretending to listen to Uncle Leo's rant about gas prices and interrupting my dad's stories with finance jargon nobody asked for, I got a text under the table that simply read, "All signed, official start date, Deck 1 PS. You were right, he is a walking red flag." That's when I knew dessert was going to taste a whole lot sweeter. When the pies came out, pecan, pumpkin, apple, I decided it was time to gently, ever so casually, place the first domino. I didn't look at Mark when I said it. I looked at Grandma. She was folding her napkin and tucking it under her plate like she always did before coffee. "You know," I began, my tone light and almost offhand, "we just signed a new financial strategist. Brilliant woman, came from the hedge fund world, Samantha Harper." There was a beat of silence, not the dramatic kind, just the kind where everyone stops chewing at once. Mark looked up. His face didn't twitch, but his hand paused midair. "Samantha Harper?" Aunt Diane asked, blinking slowly. "As in—" "Yep," I nodded, still smiling. "Small world, right?" And it was. A very, very small world, when you burn every bridge you cross and forget that someone else might come along and build a damn highway over your ashes. Mark opened his mouth, maybe to protest, maybe to feign indifference, but before he could say anything, Grandma, in her endless wisdom, added the perfect finishing touch. "Didn't she once say you weren't great with numbers, Mark? Looks like she found someone who is." And just like that, he shut up. No one refilled his wine after that. It wasn't even a decision, just something that happened. His glass sat there like an old trophy, forgotten and collecting dust. He tried to laugh, a low chuckle that died halfway through, like even his own throat was embarrassed to be part of the act. I cut a piece of pecan pie and took my time with it, savoring every single bite, not because it was delicious, which it was, but because it tasted like quiet victory. For years I had let him talk. I had smiled through his jabs and ignored the snide remarks he threw around like candy at Halloween. "App girl," he used to call me. "Cute little side hustle." He once told a friend of mine at a wedding that I played businesswoman on weekends. And for the longest time, I thought maybe it was just me, that maybe I was too sensitive, too eager to be respected by people who never cared to understand what I was doing. But now, in the flickering candlelight of another family holiday dinner, I realized it had never been about me. It was always about him, his failure to adapt, his inability to build, his quiet terror that the world was moving forward and he wasn't invited along for the ride. He didn't say much after that. None of the usual brags about stock tips or name-dropping old colleagues. The rest of the evening passed in a warm haze of leftovers and stories, the kind families tell when they're relaxed and not bracing for an argument. Mark faded into the wallpaper like a man trying to figure out how he became irrelevant in a room he once thought he owned. And me? I just kept sipping my coffee, smiling softly, knowing full well this wasn't the end. Because sometimes revenge doesn't come in a single blow, it comes in layers, and mine had only just begun. The truth about family, the kind that nobody says out loud, but everyone carries like an itch under the skin, is that beneath the smiling photos, the Facebook comments, and the annual traditions where someone always forgets the cranberry sauce, there is a brutal scoreboard that keeps track of who made it, who didn't, and who's still pretending. And on that scoreboard, even the smallest victory gets measured not just in success, but in silence. The way people stop interrupting you. The way eyes flicker to you for confirmation before someone finishes a sentence. The way nobody laughs when your name is mentioned anymore. Not because you got less funny, but because you got powerful. And on that particular Thanksgiving evening, as the coffee brewed and Grandma's comments still echoed gently between the walls, I knew that Mark, despite his forced smirk and clenched teeth, had finally felt that shift. But he wasn't done. Men like Mark rarely go quietly. It's not in their wiring. He was one of those guys who believed respect was his by default, like an inheritance passed down through bad suits and louder voices. And when that respect starts to dry up, they don't just go thirsty, they start trying to steal it back. So I wasn't surprised when, after an uncomfortable 10 minutes where he didn't say much more than a grunt in response to anyone, he suddenly leaned forward in his chair, rested both elbows on the table like he was preparing to deliver some grand truth, and asked, loud enough for everyone to hear, "So you're saying your app managed to poach my ex-wife?" He used the word poach, like we were still in corporate warfare, like Samantha was a deer I'd hunted in some old boy network forest, and not a grown, accomplished woman who had looked at her options and chosen mine. And I'll admit, for a brief second, I was tempted to return fire with a sharp laugh and a cutting line, something dramatic and final, the kind of moment TV writers would script for applause. But instead, I looked at him calmly, took a sip of my coffee, and said, "No, Mark." She applied. She came to us. The words weren't defensive. They didn't need to be. They just sat there, solid and undeniable. The kind of truth you can't argue with without making yourself look foolish. But he tried anyway. "She wouldn't have even looked at something like your company 5 years ago," he said. And the bitterness in his voice was like vinegar cutting through the sweetness of the evening. And that's when I finally allowed myself to speak. Not just as a family member enduring another awkward dinner, but as the woman who had, for too long, let herself be the subject of jokes she never deserved. I leaned forward just enough to meet his eyes, not to intimidate, but to anchor, to make sure every word landed exactly where it needed to. "You know what's funny, Mark?" I said, the words rolling slowly but clearly. "I don't remember applying to Wall Street, but your ex sure did apply to me." That line, more than anything else I could have said, was the real end of the conversation. It wasn't just a clapback. It was a ledger closing. The reaction around the table wasn't laughter or shock. It was something quieter, heavier, a shift in posture. A few eyes flicked down to their plates. Aunt Diane reached for the whipped cream and tried to offer it to someone who already had some. And Mark finally looked like he'd run out of comebacks. There's a moment in every long-standing power imbalance where the old weight finally lifts off your shoulders and you realize it was never yours to carry. It was someone else's insecurity that had been tossed onto you and called truth. And in that moment, staring across the table at a man who had spent years trying to keep me small so he could feel big, I finally felt it. Freedom, not from the family, but from that version of myself who once needed his validation. I leaned back, let the hum of the room settle again, and noticed that the family had moved on to safer topics. My uncle was complaining about taxes. My mom had brought up someone's wedding next year. And Mark just sat there, spinning his spoon slowly in his coffee, like it held the answers he couldn't find in himself. I watched him for a few seconds, not out of cruelty but curiosity. It's a strange thing watching someone realize that the version of you they mocked has not only survived but thrived, and that no amount of sarcasm or cheap shots can put you back in that box again. He was realizing, probably for the first time in his life, that success isn't always loud, but it sure as hell is visible when it walks into a room wearing confidence and doesn't ask for a seat. It takes one. Later that night, as people started gathering their coats and packing leftovers, Mark made a half-hearted attempt to say something to me. Maybe an apology, maybe just a final jab. But he stopped himself. Maybe he saw in my eyes that I wasn't playing anymore. Maybe he finally understood that I hadn't come to win a fight, because I'd already won something bigger, my space. As I hugged Grandma goodbye, she patted my back and whispered, "You know, your grandfather would have loved this. He always said quiet girls are the ones you have to watch." And I knew then, with absolute clarity, that this wasn't just a dinner. It was a reckoning. A soft one, yes, but all the more powerful for it. Mark could keep his fake smile and his outdated metrics of success. I had something better, respect. Earned in silence, sharpened in years of work, and delivered not with noise, but with proof. There's something haunting about the sound of your own footsteps echoing in a hallway you used to run through as a child, especially when the walls still hold the scent of old furniture, cinnamon candles, and the faint, unshakable tension that always lingers after a dinner that went just a little too far. After dessert, when people began clearing the plates and packing up leftovers with the kind of forced small talk that fills the silence where something heavier used to sit. I slipped away from the kitchen, not because I needed a break, but because I wanted to remember what it felt like to walk through this house without carrying the weight of someone else's expectations on my shoulders. Mark didn't follow. He stayed behind, seated alone at the far end of the dining table, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee, with the kind of vacant stare reserved for people who just realized that the ground beneath them had been shifting for a while, and they were the last to notice. For once, he wasn't holding court with investment tips or exaggerated stories about a former boss at JP Morgan who supposedly still called him for advice. For once, no one was pretending to be impressed. But what struck me more than anything that evening wasn't his silence. It was everyone else's. Aunt Diane, who used to beam with pride every time Mark mentioned his bonus checks, didn't defend him once. Uncle Leo, who had been a cheerleader for Mark's every financial leap, made a quiet comment about humility before disappearing into the garage to find a box of Tupperware. Even my mother, who had spent years cautioning me to be gracious around him and to avoid making scenes, simply gave me a small, knowing nod when I caught her eye, like she was finally seeing me not as the daughter who always had something to prove, but as the woman who no longer needed to. But perhaps the most unexpected shift came from my father. My dad has never been a man of many words, especially not when it comes to feelings. He's the type to fix things with tools instead of apologies, to show love through perfectly grilled steaks and triple-checked car tires. For years, he didn't understand what I was building. When I first told him I was quitting my steady job to start something of my own, he stared at me for a full minute before saying, "Don't expect anyone else to believe in it if you don't." At the time, I took it as a warning. Years later, I realized it was advice. After everyone had moved into the living room to pick over desserts and argue over the football game humming in the background, he walked up beside me, hands in his pockets, and said without looking directly at me, "You did good, kid, and not just with the business. You handled that better than I would have." It was nothing elaborate, nothing dramatic, but in that one sentence, he gave me the validation I hadn't even realized I still wanted from him. And that quiet confirmation, that quiet pride, meant more to me than any loud, performative praise Mark had ever thrown around for himself. The irony of the night didn't escape me. For years, Mark had been the one with the loud voice, the big stories, the confident strut that filled a room before he even said a word. But as it turns out, confidence isn't volume, it's stillness. It's being able to sit at a table, absorb every subtle insult thrown your way, and respond not with rebuttals or rage, but with results. Because at the end of the day, the real boss isn't the one shouting orders or swinging around their resume like a sledgehammer. The real boss is the one who doesn't need to remind anyone who they are. That night, as I sat on the arm of the couch, sipping hot cider while Grandma quietly knitted in the corner, and the rest of the family rotated around their usual after-dinner conversations, I realized that this wasn't just about me and Mark. It was about something bigger. It was about how women like me, women who were never given the easy benefit of the doubt, who were told to smile more, to be polite, to wait their turn, were no longer asking for permission. We were taking up space, and not just any space, strategic, earned, undeniable space. I remembered every time Mark had made me feel small in the past, the jokes he made when I first launched the beta version of my app, and the interface glitch during a family barbecue. The time he loudly announced to everyone that I still lived in a studio apartment while real adults bought homes. The time he told me in front of my own mother that I'd be lucky if Facebook didn't bury my little project before I turned 35. And I remembered how each of those moments, instead of defeating me, had layered something inside me, something quiet and slow-burning and sharp. And now, here we were, me running a company with clients that included 2 Fortune 500 names, him crashing in his mother's guest room and nervously scanning his phone for job leads that wouldn't call back. I didn't need to say a word. The truth was already loud enough. As the night wound down and people started pulling on coats and gathering containers of mashed potatoes and pie slices wrapped in foil, Aunt Diane turned to me and said, almost as an afterthought, "You know, I think Samantha always admired your drive, even back then." It wasn't much, but it was enough. Mark didn't say goodbye when I left. I didn't expect him to. People like Mark rarely acknowledge when they've been outpaced. Not because they don't see it, but because seeing it and admitting it are two very different things. I walked out to my rental car, the cold night air biting at my cheeks, and paused just long enough to look back at the house one more time, remembering every Thanksgiving where I'd sat at that same table, wondering if I'd ever be taken seriously. Now I didn't need them to take me seriously. I just needed them to finally see me. And they did. The morning after Thanksgiving always has a certain stillness to it, a kind of quiet that feels earned after a day of overeating, overstaying, and over-talking. And as I sat alone in the kitchen at Aunt Diane's house, watching the light break through the brittle branches of the backyard trees, I realized that the real meal, the one people truly consumed, hadn't been turkey or pie or even the wine Mark clung to like a lifeline, but power, who had it, who used to have it, and who finally understood they'd never had it to begin with. That kitchen, with its floral curtains and chipped tile floor that hadn't been redone since the Clinton administration, suddenly felt like a battlefield post-conflict. Quiet, a little worn, but charged with the invisible aftermath of truths that had been spoken, and more importantly, truths that no longer needed to be. I didn't go looking for him that morning. I had no intention of continuing the confrontation or digging into the emotional wreckage left in Mark's wake, because unlike him, I didn't need the last word. I'd already had it the night before, delivered not in a scream or a pointed monologue, but through the simplest and sharpest of weapons, fact. And facts, unlike arguments, don't require amplification to carry their weight. Still, when I walked out to the driveway and saw him standing beside my rental car, arms crossed and eyes fixed on the gravel like it owed him an explanation, I knew something unsaid was still hanging between us, clinging to the cold air like fog that hadn't yet decided whether to lift or settle. He didn't look up at first, and I wasn't about to speak just to make him feel better. I opened the door, set my coffee on the roof of the car, and leaned against it, waiting, not because I expected an apology, but because part of me, some old bruised part that still remembered what it felt like to crave his approval, wanted to see if he would look me in the eye and acknowledge the shift that had happened. But Mark, true to form, took the longer route toward pretending to make peace. I was surprised, he finally muttered. Not quite facing me, not quite avoiding me either. About Sam. About the company. Didn't think you'd, go that far. There it was, not regret, not respect, just that typical Mark brand of half compliment, half accusation, like my success had been some personal betrayal, like I had crossed a line by being exactly who I promised I'd become. I could have fired back, could have reminded him how many times he told me to play it safe, how often he joked that I should find a real job, how every holiday dinner since I was 23 had included at least one moment where he talked over me like my life's work was a hobby. But instead, I shrugged, reached for my coffee, and said, "Going far is kind of the point, isn't it?" That answer clearly didn't satisfy whatever narrative he was trying to rebuild for himself. He scratched the back of his neck, a tell I recognized from childhood. He always did that when he couldn't find the words to make himself look better. "You think I meant to come off like that?" he asked, almost defensive now. "I was just joking. You know how I am." Yes, I did. I knew exactly how he was. And I knew exactly what he was doing, diluting the damage, rewriting the record, acting as though the years of mockery and condescension had been playful banter, and not calculated digs that left bruises I'd spent a decade pretending didn't sting. So I gave him nothing. No nod. No laugh, just a stillness that said quite clearly, I was done making him comfortable. And maybe that's why he finally changed tactics. "You're her boss now," he said, quieter this time. "Sam, that's a hell of a thing." I didn't answer because I didn't need to. It wasn't news to me, it was news to him. And the difference between us was that I had seen this moment coming. Maybe not the exact circumstances, not the perfect irony of hiring the woman he once couldn't hold on to, but the moment itself, the inevitable reckoning that arrives when someone who's been underestimated for too long finally builds something too big to be ignored. "You know," he added after a pause, "Grandma really threw me under the bus last night." I smiled then, because I couldn't help it. "She didn't throw you anywhere. You just weren't paying attention to where the bus was going. And with that, I opened the car door, tossed my bag into the passenger seat, and prepared to leave. Not just the house, not just the holiday, but the entire dynamic that had once made me feel like a child, pretending to be something more. But just before I pulled out of the driveway, Grandma came hobbling down the front steps with a Tupperware container in one hand and her shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders, the way she always did when the wind picked up. She handed me the container, mashed sweet potatoes, my favorite, and leaned in close enough that only I could hear. "I told your mom years ago," she said, voice as steady as her hands, "that you weren't pretending, you were building, and one day even the boys would have to shut up and watch." I drove away without looking back, the weight of years shedding off me in layers, replaced by something cleaner, sharper, and far more dangerous. Clarity that I didn't need to prove anything anymore. That the war I thought I was fighting had already been won, not with fury, but with facts, not with speeches, but with strategy. That I had, without ever raising my voice, become exactly what they told me I'd never be. The office on Monday morning was quiet, bright with early winter sunlight, and as I settled into my chair, flipping through contracts and emails, one new message caught my eye. It was from a partner I'd been negotiating with for weeks, and it was short, direct, but powerful. Wherein Mark's name came up in due diligence. "You were right, he's a risk." For a moment, I considered replying with something clever, something sharp enough to leave a mark. But instead, I hit delete, closed my laptop, and leaned back in my chair, letting the silence fill the room like applause only I could hear. Because some dinners aren't about food, some dinners are about legacy, and mine finally had begun.